Tanayadun. My name is Abdul Kadir. I'm from the UK, and my responsibility here today is moderator for this session. First of all, I would like to introduce myself and then to introduce our speaker. As I said, my name is Abdul Kadir. I work for an organization called Praxis Europe, and this organization supports young people who are facing difficulties in accessing education or employment opportunities. So what we do is we develop courses and training opportunities where we can help young people progress from education into the workplace. Our speaker today is one of my colleagues, Dr. Bob Bates. He's again from the UK, and he has a varied history of educational training and teaching. He has worked for the British Civil Service in a number of ways, supporting disabled learners and helping develop systems and processes. He has also written a number of publications around special education and training. The first book that Bob published was The Little Book of Management Theories, which was followed up by Learning Theories Simplified, and other books which I'm sure Bob will talk about and explain, as well as detailing this particular session, which is looking at special education. So over to you, Bob.
Thank you very much. I noticed on the screen I'm down as Charlie Bates. I should explain that Charlie Bates is my grandson who helped me put the presentation together. So thank you, Charlie. But I can assure you I am Bob Bates. I'd like to thank the organisers of the symposium for inviting me to take part. It's dealing with a subject that's very dear to my own heart, and one that has both professional and personal interests for me. As Abdul said, I've worked for the Department of Employment for the first 20 years of my career, mostly with adults with learning disabilities. In 1994, I switched to academia. I became a teacher educator. I got my master's degree and then my PhD in education. And for the next 15 years, I taught trainee teachers and trainers, and reckoned to have taught well over 1,000 students on management and education programs, a number of which involve people working with disabilities. In 2014, I wrote my first management book, which became an international bestseller, and amongst most European languages, has also been translated into Arabic and Japanese. I've written a further 5 books dealing with education theory, learning needs and disabilities, behaviour management, and education leadership. I've been asked by the conference to make 3 short presentations during the course of this week. The first will look at the employment and education rights of people in the UK with additional learning needs and disabilities, and the legislation that impacts on this. The second deals with the issue of behaviour management and offers a series of practical guides for the parents and teachers of children and young people with additional needs. The final presentation will look at issues of education leadership and how they impact on the behaviour of children and young people opting out of the education system. After each presentation, I'll pose a question for discussion. It's important that I stress that I don't necessarily have the answers to any of these questions. So I look forward to hearing your thoughts on this. It is therefore a great learning opportunity for me. The first presentation, therefore, will look at the employment and education rights of people in the UK with additional learning needs and disabilities, and the legislation that impacts on this. In order to be classed as a disabled person under the 1944 Disabled Persons Act in the UK, an individual has to demonstrate that they have a physical or mental impairment, and that the impairment has a substantial and long-term effect on their ability to carry out normal day-to-day work activities. In a work context, therefore, a wheelchair user who has a sedentary job, such as a telephonist or receptionist, may not, under the Act, be classified as disabled because there are no impairments physically or mentally to their ability to do that particular work. Whereas a fashion model or an actor with a facial scar may be classed as disabled because it may affect their ability to find work in that field. The focus of the Disability Act, therefore, is on the individual and not on the disability. Some statistics now, the employment rights of people with disabilities. There are just over 12 million people with disabilities in the UK. This represents 20% of the population. But many of these people are the elderly or the very young. And there are estimated to be just over half that number with disabilities who are of working age. Just over 50% of impairments are related to lifting and carrying restrictions, and there are just over 1 million wheelchair users, again, mainly people of an elder age. There are over 1 million people in the UK with sight restrictions or hearing impairments that affect them at work, and nearly 2 million adults who are considered to have a hidden disability, such as a learning disability or a mental illness. People with disabilities are 33% more likely to experience barriers to educational opportunities and 16% more likely to experience restrictions to training opportunities. They are 2 to 3 times more likely to have no formal qualifications than adults with disabilities. They are more likely to be in low status, unskilled employment, with only 12% in professional or managerial positions, compared with 21% of able-bodied workers. They are estimated to be paid about 10% less than non-disabled people, and 30% of people with disabilities reported having received unfair treatment at work, including workplace bullying or harassment because of their disability. They also thought that workplaces were inflexible to their needs. We therefore have a picture of people with disabilities having poorer career opportunities and being less favourably treated than their able-bodied counterparts. In terms of relevancy within a modern context, it's important to look briefly at the legislation introduced in the UK to protect the employment rights of people with disabilities. The 1944 Disabled Persons Act was a measure introduced towards the end of the Second World War to help returning disabled servicemen and women to find employment. The Act made provision for the establishment of a register for disabled persons and the provision of rehabilitation and training. It also placed a duty on employers of more than 20 people to employ a quota of 3% of the jobs available to be reserved for registered disabled people. Under the Act, employers were expected to give preferential treatment to registered disabled applicants. And if they were below the 3% quota, had to apply for permission to the Department of Employment to recruit able-bodied workers. Specialist officers known as Disablement Resettlement Officers, DROs, were recruited to advise employers on their obligations, help them to recruit suitably qualified people with disabilities, and instigate enforcement procedures against employers who refuse to comply with the provisions set out in the Act. The 1944 Act was replaced in 1995 by the Disability Discrimination Act, which gave a clearer definition of what it meant to be a disabled person. and place an obligation on employers to make reasonable adjustments to their workplace to accommodate people with disabilities. This Act was subsequently replaced in 2010 by the Equality Act. This Act replaced many previous anti-discrimination laws, such as the Disability Discrimination Act, the 1975 Sex Discrimination Act, and the 1976 Race Relations Act. Replaced them all with a single act, thus making the law easier to understand and strengthening protection in some situations. The Equality Act didn't just relate to employment, it protected people from discrimination by employers, schools, colleges and other education providers, businesses and organisations which provide goods or services, such as banks, shops and utility companies, health and care providers like hospitals and care homes, housing associations, landlords and estate agents, transport services such as buses, trains and taxis, and public bodies like government departments and local authorities. The Equality Act brought together over 100 separate pieces of legislation to create an explicit legal framework to protect the rights of individuals and advance equality. Whilst it remains the cornerstone of our legislation around equality, many of the Act's critics argue that the world has moved on a great deal in the intervening years and that the Act is no longer fit for purpose. I'd like now to switch the emphasis from employment to disability and education. The term special education needs, SEN, was first used in the UK in 1978. It focused on the needs of each individual rather than on categories of disability. Since September 1994, the provision for young children, for children and young people with special education needs has been determined by the following approach. The strengthening of rights for children and young people with special needs to be educated in mainstream schools. Local authorities to provide advice and information to parents as a means of resolving disputes over SEN entitlements. Education providers to have a duty to inform parents when making SEN provision for their child. And finally, schools have the right to request a statutory assessment of a child who they suspect may have special needs. According to the Department for Education 2020 report on special education needs in England, there are approximately 1.5 million pupils, that's nearly 20% of the total number of school-aged children with special education needs stemming from physical or mental impairments. Academic achievements over the past 10 years has increased from 19.8% to 59.2% for special education need pupils. This compares to an increase from 66.3% to 88.9% for pupils without special education needs. In January 2015, the government launched its Code of Practice on working with children and young people with disabilities. The Code of Practice offers guidance for educational organisations which work with and support children and young people who have special education needs or disabilities. The vision behind the undertaking was that the experience of a child or young person with additional needs would be less confrontational and no different from the experiences of any other children or young people. Special education needs were at the heart of this vision. It seems appropriate now to look at the structure of special education needs schools in the UK and to see how this vision is being implemented. There are approximately 1,000 special education needs schools in the UK. SEN schools are usually divided into primary, ages 5 to 10, and secondary, ages 11 to 18. Some schools designate their 16 to 18-year-old pupils as being in further education, with pupils over the age of 16 having the option of staying in school, moving to a further education college, or leaving full-time education completely. A typical class in a special education needs school in the UK will have one qualified teacher, usually educated to graduate or postgraduate level, and 1 or 2 teaching assistants with levels ranging from 1 to 4. We probably all understand what the role of the classroom teacher is, so I'd like to focus on 2 other important members of the school teaching setup. Firstly, teaching assistants. I've worked with dozens of teaching assistants during my career as a teacher educator. Their role is to support the teachers by working with pupils in their class, often handling the more severely disabled pupils and dealing with tasks such as restraining children acting aggressively and changing soiled underwear. There is a progression route for teaching assistants ranging from level 1 through to level 4. Level 1 teaching assistants have a very limited role in the class. This may be restricted to helping teachers to prepare the classroom. Level 2 teaching assistants play a more active role. This may involve restraining children acting aggressively. Level 3 teaching assistants will be expected to prepare materials for teaching, and some will cover for the classroom teacher during their absence. Some teaching assistants at level 4 will operate as classroom teachers. I'd like at this stage to tell you a story that one teaching assistant, we'll call her Mrs. Smith, recently told me about an incident that happened during a lesson and how she used her experience of life to deal with it. This is Hope's story. Hope Adams is 11-year-old. She was born with Down syndrome. She is a quiet, confident girl, well-liked by everyone, but in common with most 11-year-olds, prone to tantrums or outbursts. When she has such a tantrum, she has to be told off and loses some of her classroom privileges. When this happens, she crunches the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th fingers of her left hand into a fist, and by raising the thumb and little finger, makes an imaginary phone. She then punches a few numbers into the phone and tells her dad that her teacher, Mrs. Smith, is being nasty to her. She then gives Mrs. Smith a defiant look and warns her that her dad's going to sort her out. In Hope's mind, this gives legitimacy to her naughty behaviour. One day, after a particularly bad bout of tantrums and subsequent telling off by her teacher, Hope went to pick up her imaginary phone. As she did this, her teacher motioned to take it off her, and making her own phone, she told Hope's dad that Hope had been naughty and that he had to take the phone off her till her behaviour improved. Imagine Hope's look of amazement when this happened. Mrs. Smith could easily have used the real phone and told Mr. Adams that Hope was behaving inappropriately. But by entering Hope's world, however, she was able to have a much greater impact on her behaviour than the consequences of a telling off by her parents would have had. The second teaching assistant or teacher that I'd like to focus on is the Special Education Needs Coordinator, or the SENCO. A SENCO is a qualified teacher who is designated as the Special Education Needs Coordinator for the school. They have an important role to play in determining the strategic development of the school's special education needs policies and practices. They also have day-to-day responsibilities for supporting children and young people with special needs and working closely with staff and parents. The SENCO must also make sure that their school has a policy on managing medical needs, which must include a policy statement in how to deal with children with chronic illness, such as asthma and diabetes, procedures to administer medication, and for recording any treatment given and notifying parents that this has happened. And then developing a healthcare plan for each child or young person suffering a chronic illness and a procedure for reviewing this with parents. Being appointed a SENCO can be an overwhelming task for any teacher, especially where the role is considered secondary or supplementary to other teaching duties. Teaching children with special needs provides a tough challenge for any teacher, and the work that SENCOs can do can only be effective if it is embedded within the vision and values of the school leadership that puts learning for all at the heart of its mission. In preparation for the symposium, we asked SENCOs in 5 schools in the UK to give us a breakdown of the type of conditions that were evident within the children that they work with within the school. There was a pattern across the 5 schools that fitted the following profile.